Go.
I'd like to ask the first two speakers to elaborate on what we actually do mean concretely when we structurally speak and say that the development of the prefrontal cortex is slow or the brittle striatum is faster than the prefrontal cortex in terms of, are we speaking about a slowness in dendritic branching, synaptic pruning, total number of synapses? And the reason I ask is because some years ago, an influential paper by Pat Goldman-Rakesh in monkey development argued that synaptic density, not an optimal measure, but synaptic density was actually the same across all association cortices.
Let me just start with your last point. I think that the data from the non-human primate, particularly Pat's work, is absolutely key. Our human data is not as comprehensive. What they showed, and also Pierre Bourgeois, who was working in that group along with Pasco, is that while they have comparable peaks in terms of the number, the plateau is actually different in the prefrontal cortex, and they did a number of manipulations to show that. So you get a gross, exaggerated number that goes above the adult, and then it subsequently comes down in a number of areas, but the prefrontal cortex is one area where it seems to stay up a little bit longer. And I've had a number of communications with that lab to be consistent with that. With the human imaging, I would never want to say that cortical thickness or the functional pattern of brain activity that we're seeing maps on directly to synaptic connections. What we're doing is trying to take a converging approach and taking the best of what we know from the animal literature and then asking questions that we can't ask in the animal models in the humans to get as much traction as we can.
I have a question that anyone on the panel could answer, and maybe all three of you would want to answer it. It concerns the social implications and legal implications. We know there are individual differences among adolescents. What you're talking about are mean changes over the course of the adolescent lifespan. Why shouldn't the legal system, to the extent possible, try to individualize when we're thinking about criminal responsibility as opposed to doing it by group?
I'll try. Well, of course, that was the issue in Graham. And there isn't any inherent reason, if we could do it objectively and do it reliably. I mean, we have a study from our MacArthur Network that showed that when individuals were given crime scenarios to read and then make judgments of culpability and responsibility, that those who were led to believe that the perpetrator was black rated the person as more culpable, more mature, more deserving of harsh punishment than people who were not led to believe that. So the question is, who's going to make these judgments of maturity? How easy is it for attorneys to manipulate the way that juries or judges evaluate somebody's maturity, and whether, in some senses, it isn't fairer just to have a chronological age boundary, as we do for, entering into contracts or applying for a driver's license, we don't administer tests of maturity to see who can get in to see an X-rated movie and who can't. So it seems in some senses it may be more practical from a purely pragmatic point of view to have a chronological age boundary.
I have a question about one of the current issue in the U.S. is life without parole for juveniles, and I guess I'm wondering. It seems as though to me that these issues around adolescent development are even more applicable in those cases than they were in Graham and Roper, because the issue, of course, is not just the culpability of the juvenile, but the potential for change over time. I'm wondering if you're feeling like that's getting a little ahead of where we are with things, or if that's probably right.
I can take it. Actually, I'm going to build on some of Kent's data in terms of the potential for change over time, where he referred to some of the functional connectivity and the way circuits are forming, and very early on in individuals that may be at risk or look like their behavior may lead to psychopathy, that those networks just weren't formed. This is a suggestion that we might have greater plasticity during this time, but the brain is, I want to build on something that Larry said earlier, the brain is very plastic, and with every behavioral change you see, at even our age as old farts, you see that change in the brain. So while we think that there is potential for increased plasticity early in the system before it gets a bit more entrenched with all of that experience, there's always potential for change. So I think there's implications for the legal system across the lifespan, but particularly for children in this way.
Thank you. I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that different jurisdictions in the United States have different ways of going about this. But in many of them, the question as to whether to charge a child as an adult is a decision by the prosecutor that is then often reviewed by the judge, so that you do get some differentiation that's not just age, but that you then get actually fairly specific application to an individual and the crime committed by the individual as to whether he or she should be charged and prosecuted as an adult. Do you know if there's been much research done on what criteria are articulated, how well they're thought through, and how well the systems work?
Yes. Most people would talk about the Kent criteria, which have to do with amenability to rehabilitation, the seriousness of the current offense, and the evidence of maturity. And they're not operationalized any more than that. It does not appear, I think the consensus among most people who've been studying this is that most of the decision-making about transfer is being driven by the number of priors the person has and the seriousness of the charged offense, and that they're not really taking into account the amenability to rehabilitation or psychological maturity. We've done a little research on that in our group in just looking at two jurisdictions in Philadelphia and Phoenix, and found no evidence that there was individualized decision-making of the sort that is in principle supposed to be taking place. The other part of the equation is the fact that that the jurisdiction in which juveniles are charged often is dictated by the legislature. It's not a prosecutorial decision, and it's certainly not a judicial decision in many cases. And if you were just to chart out the number of, if you were to look at the proportion of kids that are in the adult system, about 250,000 or so a year, that the vast majority of them are there because they live in a state where that age is considered an adult for that crime, not because of prosecutorial decision-making and not because of judicial decision-making.
I have maybe this is a stupid question. Do you have any data or investigation of neuroimaging of trauma or abuse? And is there any evidence?
Is that abuse before the age of 6, that often is associated with PTSD, predicts the poorest outcome. But we also know that maltreatment and abuse during the adolescent period may have regionally specific effects, particularly on the prefrontal cortex. And there was one structural study by Anderson who showed that girls who were young adults at the time who had been sexually abused during adolescence as opposed to other periods in life showed different structural patterns within the prefrontal cortex. So the point at which abuse occurs that may be associated with trauma is likely to have differential impact depending on when that happens. And there's a very high concordance with levels of PTSD, and often it's difficult to tease apart what's associated with that psychopathology and what's actually associated with the impact of maltreatment per se.
I'm just going to add some complexity to this, although probably we should be simplifying terms. There's been some recent evidence to suggest that potential maltreatment or associations that occur during adolescence may be masked and emerge later, specifically talking about rodent work where you expose an adolescent rodent to a context in which they're shocked. They show less freezing behavior, which is probably adaptive from an evolutionary point of view. Then later, if they're in that context, not into adulthood, do you see a response as if it's a latent memory, and then it's exaggerated beyond what you see at other points of development if they were exposed to that. So I think it just gets really complicated. The more we know, the more we know we don't know.
Last question. I wanted to follow up Nick Rose's earlier question about changes over history in adolescence. I thought your response that the 18th century was quite different from now is obviously true. But there are a lot of other cultures on the planet right now that may be living in worlds more similar to the 18th century than ours. Has there been any work done looking at these issues in radically different cultures?
We're in the field now doing a replication of the MacArthur Capacity Study in 11 different countries, including some that are highly developed, like Sweden, and some that are underdeveloped, like Kenya or Jordan. So stay tuned. How long? We have, it's a cross-sectional study, and we should probably have data collected in by a year, maybe.
But just to build on that, I think this goes back to the field of adolescent psychology, where there was this real tension between G. Stanley Hall, who said every adolescent goes through this tumultuous, stressful period, and Margaret Mead, who is a cultural anthropologist, suggesting that there were societies where you don't see it exaggerated, and really where we are somewhere in between. But I do want to come back to a point and address in part previous questions, and that is the development of these systems are a function of experience. And so one of the cartoons that Larry presented was, basically locking up their child until they're 21 and then bringing them out. And I used to think about that when Nora Volkow would present her drug abuse slides. I would think just lock them up so they're not exposed and then bring them out. But a very important part of development, and I think it also has implications for how we treat juveniles, is giving them the opportunity to regulate their behavior in a pro-social way. And I think that's very important when we consider how we treat juveniles.
Can I just add one thing? I think Hank's question is very important. In the lab, we're studying what we think are the underlying processes. And there I would expect that we'd see a lot of similarities across cultures in many of these things. How they're manifested, in a society in which you can't drink, so let's say in Jordan, I don't expect we'd find a lot of binge drinking among teenagers there, but they may manifest sensation seeking in a completely different way. So I think you have to differentiate between the underlying neurobiological and neuropsychological processes where they may be more common if they're driven by certain universal features of biological maturation during adolescence, and the final sort of phenotype, which is going to be constrained by opportunities and by socialization and cultural context.
And on that note, I think I'm going to give you all a chance to go and regulate your own pro-social behaviours over a cup of coffee. That was a fantastic session, and let's thank our three speakers and panellists again.